For more than a century, Venezuela has occupied a unique and often tense place in the imagination of U.S. foreign policy. Rich in natural resources yet politically volatile, geographically close yet ideologically defiant, Venezuela is not just another Latin American country. It is a strategic puzzle the United States has never fully been willing to step away from. To understand why Washington seems reluctant to let Venezuela go, one must begin not with modern sanctions or political speeches, but with oil, power, and the early foundations of American global ambition. At the dawn of the 20th century, oil transformed from a useful commodity into the lifeblood of modern civilization. Ships, factories, armies, and economies began to depend on it. When massive oil reserves were discovered beneath Venezuelan soil in the 1910s and 1920s, the country instantly became one of the most valuable energy territories in the world. For the United States, still emerging as a global power, Venezuela represented something priceless, a vast oil supplier located in its own hemisphere, outside the reach of European rivals. By the 1920s, U.S. and British oil companies dominated Venezuela's petroleum sector. American corporations built infrastructure, refineries, and pipelines, while Washington quietly ensured that Venezuelan governments remained friendly to foreign investment. This relationship was not framed as colonial control, but the outcome was similar. Venezuela's oil wealth flowed outward, while its political system bent inward to accommodate external interests. From the very beginning, U.S. influence in Venezuela was not accidental, it was strategic. During World War II, Venezuela became even more critical. As global conflict disrupted oil supplies elsewhere, Venezuelan crude fueled Allied ships and aircraft. Protecting Venezuela's oil fields became synonymous with protecting U.S. national security. This period cemented a long-standing belief in Washington: instability in Venezuela was not a regional issue, it was a global risk. That mindset never truly disappeared. After the war, the Cold War reshaped U.S. priorities. Latin America was no longer just a source of raw materials, it was a battleground for influence between capitalism and communism. Venezuela, with its oil wealth and relatively strong democratic institutions, was viewed as a model ally, proof that U.S.-aligned capitalism could succeed in the region. Any threat to that alignment was treated as a threat to American credibility. This explains why the United States paid close attention when Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in the 1970s. While nationalization itself did not immediately break relations, it planted a seed of concern. Control over oil meant control over political independence. Washington tolerated Venezuela's assertion of sovereignty only as long as it did not challenge the broader U.S.-led global order. The moment Venezuela's independence began to look ideological rather than economic, alarm bells rang. Those alarm bells grew louder in the late 1990s with the rise of Hugo Chavez. Chavez was not merely a new president, he represented a direct rejection of U.S. influence. He spoke openly against American interventionism, forged alliances with U.S. adversaries, and reimagined Venezuela's oil not as a market commodity, but as a political weapon. Oil revenues were redirected towards social programs at home and diplomatic leverage abroad. For Washington, this was not just defiance, it was precedent. The fear was never limited to Venezuela alone. U.S. policymakers worried about the demonstration effect. If Venezuela could break away from U.S. influence and survive, perhaps even thrive, other resource-rich nations might follow. This concern has shaped American foreign policy for decades. The question was never simply what happens in Venezuela, but what happens if Venezuela succeeds without us. Geography intensified these fears. Venezuela lies just a few hours' flight from Florida. Unlike distant conflicts in the Middle East or Central Asia, instability in Venezuela unfolds almost at America's doorstep. Migration flows, energy markets, drug trafficking routes, and regional alliances are all directly affected. From a strategic perspective, the U.S. views disengagement not as neutrality, but as vulnerability. Another layer to this reluctance lies in global energy politics. Even as the United States increased its own oil production in the 21st century, Venezuela's reserves, among the largest on Earth, remain significant. Control over energy resources is not only about supply, it is about influence over prices, alliances, and geopolitical leverage. A Venezuela aligned with rival powers challenges U.S. dominance in the global energy system, regardless of how much oil America produces at home. Over time, U.S. policy toward Venezuela shifted from quiet influence to open pressure. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and support for opposition movements became tools of containment. Critics argue these policies worsen Venezuela's humanitarian crisis, while supporters insist they were necessary to counter authoritarianism. But beneath the moral language lies a consistent strategic goal: preventing Venezuela from becoming fully independent of U.S. influence. Ultimately, the U.S. reluctance to let Venezuela go is not about one leader, one ideology, or even one crisis. It is about history. It is about oil shaping power, power shaping policy, and policy hardening into habit. Venezuela represents a rare convergence of energy wealth, ideological defiance, and geographic proximity. For Washington, letting Venezuela go would mean accepting limits to its influence, something great powers rarely do willingly. As the 21st century unfolds, the question remains unresolved. Is Venezuela a sovereign nation free to chart its own path, or a strategic asset too important to lose? The answer lies not only in Caracas, but in Washington's understanding of power itself. And that understanding was forged long before today's headlines. When Hugo Chavez won Venezuela's presidency in 1998, it was not just a change of leadership, it was a rupture. For decades, the United States had grown accustomed to Venezuelan governments that, while imperfect, aligned broadly with Washington's economic and geopolitical preferences. Chavez represented something fundamentally different: a leader who openly rejected U.S. dominance and framed his presidency as a revolution against imperial control. Chavez emerged from the Venezuelan military, shaped by poverty, inequality, and a deep resentment of elites who had benefited from oil wealth while millions remained poor. His rise was fueled by frustration with a political system many Venezuelans saw as corrupt and submissive to foreign interests. To his supporters, Chavez was a voice of dignity and sovereignty. To Washington, he was an unpredictable populist with dangerous ideas. From the beginning, Chavez made it clear that Venezuela's oil would no longer serve foreign priorities first. He strengthened state control over the National Oil Company, PDVSA, increased taxes and royalties on foreign firms, and redirected oil revenue toward social programs. These policies lifted millions out of extreme poverty and dramatically expanded access to healthcare and education. But they also reduced the influence of U.S. corporations and limited Washington's leverage over Venezuela's economy. More troubling for U.S. policymakers was Chavez's rhetoric. He did not merely criticize specific policies, he challenged the legitimacy of U.S. global leadership itself. He described American foreign policy as imperialist, accused Washington of exploiting the global South, and urged other nations to resist U.S. pressure. In a post-Cold War world where the United States enjoyed near unchecked dominance, this kind of defiance was rare and unsettling. The confrontation escalated dramatically in 2002. Amid growing tensions, Chavez was briefly removed from power in a military-backed coup. For 2 days, a new government declared itself in charge. The United States was quick to signal approval, refusing to label the event a coup and calling for Chavez's resignation. But massive popular protests and loyal military units restored Chavez to power within 48 hours. The episode left a permanent scar on U.S.-Venezuela relations. For Chavez, the coup attempt confirmed his darkest suspicions. He became convinced that Washington would never tolerate an independent Venezuela. In response, he accelerated his revolutionary agenda. Media laws were tightened, political opposition faced increasing pressure, and the state expanded its role across the economy. Critics labeled him authoritarian, supporters argued he was defending the revolution from foreign subversion. On the international stage, Chavez moved decisively to reduce Venezuela's dependence on the United States. He forged close ties with Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran, countries that either opposed U.S. influence or sought to challenge it. Oil agreements with Caribbean and Latin American nations allowed Venezuela to use energy as diplomatic leverage, building regional alliances outside Washington's orbit. Perhaps the most symbolic moment came in 2006, when Chavez addressed the United Nations General Assembly. Holding up Noam Chomsky's book Hegemony or Survival, he referred to the U.S. president as the devil and accused America of spreading war and destruction. The speech went viral, cementing Chávez's global image as the loudest anti-imperialist voice in the Western Hemisphere. From Washington's perspective, Chávez was no longer just a problem, he was a threat to regional order. U.S. officials feared that his model of resource nationalism and anti-American populism could spread. Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua soon elected leaders inspired by Chávez's vision. This so-called pink tide alarmed U.S. strategists who had long assumed Latin America was firmly within America's sphere of influence, yet despite intense hostility, the United States never fully severed ties. Venezuelan oil continued to flow north, and American refineries remained dependent on its heavy crude. This contradiction, economic interdependence amid political confrontation, defined the Chávez era. Washington wanted to weaken Chávez's influence without destabilizing energy markets or triggering regional chaos. Over time, U.S. policy shifted toward containment. Sanctions targeted specific officials. Funding for opposition groups increased. Diplomatic pressure intensified. But Chávez proved resilient. High oil prices during the 2000s gave him financial breathing room and allowed him to fund both domestic programs and international alliances. For many in the global South, he became a symbol of resistance to U.S. dominance. Chávez's death in 2013 marked the end of an era, but not the end of the conflict. His successor inherited a polarized nation, an oil-dependent economy, and a hostile relationship with Washington. By then, the struggle was no longer about Chávez himself. It was about whether Venezuela's challenge to U.S. power would survive beyond the man who launched it. In retrospect, Hugo Chávez forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable reality: power does not guarantee obedience. Venezuela's defiance exposed the limits of American influence, especially when combined with popular support and resource wealth. Letting Venezuela go would have meant accepting that a nation in America's backyard could reject U.S. leadership and still endure. For Washington, that was a lesson it was not ready to accept. And so, the struggle continued, long after Chávez was gone. When Nicolás Maduro assumed Venezuela's presidency in 2013, he inherited a nation already under immense strain. The charismatic authority of Hugo Chávez was gone, oil prices were beginning to fall, and political polarization had hardened into open hostility. For the United States, this transition marked an opportunity, and a test. Could pressure succeed where confrontation had failed? Maduro lacked Chávez's global stature and rhetorical power. Where Chávez was defiant and theatrical, Maduro appeared rigid and defensive. Washington quickly recalibrated its strategy, shifting from ideological containment to economic coercion. Sanctions became the primary instrument. Officially framed as targeted measures against corruption and authoritarianism, these sanctions would soon expand into one of the most aggressive economic pressure campaigns ever applied in the Western Hemisphere. The first wave of U.S. sanctions, introduced in 2015, focused on individual Venezuelan officials. But by 2017 and 2019, the scope widened dramatically. Financial sanctions restricted Venezuela's access to international credit markets. Oil sanctions struck at the heart of the economy, limiting the ability of PDVSA to export crude, process payments, and import critical equipment. The message was clear: economic pain would force political change. From Washington's perspective, sanctions were a non-military alternative, a way to apply pressure without boots on the ground. U.S. officials argued that responsibility for the crisis lay squarely with Maduro's government, citing mismanagement, corruption, and democratic backsliding. The goal, they said, was to restore democracy by isolating an illegitimate regime, but inside Venezuela, the impact was devastating. Oil production collapsed, government revenue evaporated, and imports of food and medicine dwindled. Inflation spiraled into the millions of %. Ordinary Venezuelans, already struggling, found themselves at the center of a geopolitical showdown they did not control. Critics of U.S. policy described the sanctions as collective punishment, arguing they deepened suffering without producing meaningful political reform. The humanitarian crisis quickly became global news. Images of empty supermarket shelves, malnourished children, and mass migration dominated headlines. Millions fled to neighboring countries, creating one of the largest displacement crises in modern Latin American history. For Washington, this chaos was both a challenge and a tool. On one hand, it destabilized the region. On the other, it reinforced the narrative of a failed socialist state. In 2019, the confrontation reached a new level when the United States formally recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president. The move was unprecedented. Washington urged allies to follow suit and called on the Venezuelan military to abandon Maduro. Sanctions were tightened further, and billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets abroad were frozen or transferred to opposition control. This was not merely pressure, it was an attempt at political replacement. Yet the gamble failed. The military remained loyal to Maduro. International support for Guaidó fractured. Over time, his influence waned, while Maduro consolidated control. The sanctions remained, but the anticipated collapse of the government never arrived. As the years passed, Venezuela adapted. Sanctions evasion networks emerged. Oil found new buyers through intermediaries. Ties with Russia, China, and Iran deepened. The economy remained fragile, but the state survived. This endurance raised uncomfortable questions in Washington. If maximum pressure could not achieve regime change, what was its real function? Critics began to argue that sanctions had evolved from a tool into a policy trap. Lifting them without concessions could be seen as weakness. Maintaining them prolonged suffering without clear gains. Yet the deeper issue was symbolic. Sanctions had become a signal, to allies and rivals alike, that defying the United States carries consequences, even if those consequences are imperfect. The Venezuelan crisis also revealed how humanitarian narratives can be weaponized. Both sides claimed moral high ground. The U.S. framed sanctions as support for democracy. Caracas framed them as economic warfare. Aid shipments, international reports, and media coverage became battlegrounds of perception. The crisis was no longer just economic, it was informational. Despite this, Venezuela never fully disappeared from U.S. strategic thinking. Its oil reserves, though crippled, remained significant. Its alignment with U.S. adversaries persisted. And its survival under pressure complicated America's broader strategy of deterrence. Letting Venezuela go would have meant admitting that sanctions, one of Washington's most relied upon tools, have limits. By the early 2020s, cracks appeared in the hardline approach. Quiet negotiations resumed. Limited sanctions relief was discussed in exchange for electoral reforms and energy cooperation. Global energy shocks reminded Washington that Venezuela's oil could not be ignored forever. Pragmatism began to compete with principle. Still, the fundamental dilemma remained unresolved. The sanctions regime had transformed Venezuela into a cautionary tale, but not the one Washington intended. Instead of proving that defiance leads to collapse, it showed that states can endure extraordinary pressure if they are willing to absorb pain and find alternatives. In this sense, Venezuela became more than a crisis. It became a case study in the modern limits of U.S. power. Economic warfare could wound, but not necessarily control. Humanitarian catastrophe could shock the world, but not guarantee compliance. And the longer the crisis dragged on, the harder it became to claim moral clarity. The question was no longer whether sanctions caused suffering, that was undeniable. The question was whether suffering was achieving anything at all. As Venezuela staggered forward, bruised but unbroken, Washington faced a reality it has long struggled to accept. Sometimes, refusing to let go only tightens the knot. By the late 2010s, the Venezuela crisis was no longer just a bilateral standoff between Caracas and Washington. It had evolved into something far larger, a stage for renewed great power competition. As U.S. pressure intensified, Venezuela leaned increasingly toward rivals of the United States, most notably Russia and China. This shift transformed Venezuela from a regional issue into a geopolitical flashpoint. For Washington, this development was deeply unsettling. The Western Hemisphere had long been considered a zone of privileged U.S. influence. While ideological diversity was tolerated, the presence of rival great powers, especially in strategic sectors like energy and defense, crossed an invisible line. Venezuela was no longer simply defying U.S. policy, it was opening the door to competitors in America's own backyard. Russia's involvement was the most overtly confrontational. Under Vladimir Putin, Moscow saw Venezuela as an opportunity to challenge U.S. dominance symbolically and strategically. Arms sales, military cooperation agreements, and joint exercises sent a clear message: Russia could project power in the Western Hemisphere just as the U.S. does near Russia's borders. Russian bombers landing in Venezuela, though largely symbolic, triggered alarm in Washington. The actual military value was limited, but the psychological impact was enormous. These images evoked Cold War memories and reinforced fears that Venezuela could become a forward operating space for U.S. adversaries. From the American perspective, disengaging from Venezuela now risked leaving a vacuum others would eagerly fill. China's approach was quieter, but arguably more consequential. Unlike Russia, Beijing avoided inflammatory rhetoric. Instead, it focused on long-term economic positioning. Over the years, China extended tens of billions of dollars in loans to Venezuela, often backed by future oil deliveries. These agreements gave Venezuela critical financial lifelines while locking China into preferential access to one of the world's largest oil reserves. For Xi Jinping, Venezuela fit neatly into China's broader global strategy, securing energy resources, expanding influence in the global south, and presenting itself as an alternative partner to U.S.-led institutions. While China avoided openly challenging Washington over Venezuela, its growing presence complicated any U.S. effort to isolate the country completely. From Washington's point of view, this was the nightmare scenario. Sanctions designed to weaken Venezuela were pushing it deeper into the arms of America's rivals. Instead of forcing submission, pressure was accelerating geopolitical realignment. Venezuela was becoming a living example of a multipolar world, one where U.S. power was influential, but no longer absolute. Iran also entered the picture, providing fuel shipments, technical assistance, and sanctions evasion expertise. Though Iran's role was smaller, its presence reinforced a troubling pattern: U.S. adversaries collaborating openly inside the Western Hemisphere. Each alliance made it harder for Washington to justify disengagement. Energy geopolitics lay at the heart of this rivalry. Venezuela's oil reserves are not just vast, they are strategic. Whoever helps revive and control their production gains leverage over global energy markets. For the United States, allowing rivals to dominate Venezuela's energy future would mean surrendering influence over a resource that once underpinned its own energy security. There was also a reputational dimension. U.S. policymakers worried about the message sent to other countries watching closely. If Venezuela could defy Washington, survive sanctions, and secure backing from rival powers, what would stop others from doing the same? In this sense, Venezuela became a test case for U.S. credibility in an era of declining unipolar dominance, yet great power competition also constrained U.S. options. Direct military intervention risked escalation with Russia. Overly aggressive sanctions risked strengthening China's economic foothold. Diplomatic disengagement risked irrelevance. Every path forward carried strategic costs. This complexity explains the contradictions in U.S. policy. Publicly, Washington framed its actions as a defense of democracy and human rights. Privately, strategic calculations loomed large. Venezuela mattered not only for what it was, but for who else was there. The broader global context amplified these concerns. As tensions rose between the U.S., Russia, and China elsewhere, Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, the Middle East, Venezuela became part of a connected chessboard. Influence lost in one region could reverberate across others. In such a world, letting go was no longer a simple choice, it was a strategic gamble. Over time, Venezuela's role evolved from defiant outlier to geopolitical hinge. It demonstrated how smaller states can leverage rivalry among great powers to survive pressure. By playing Washington's rivals against one another, Caracas gained room to maneuver, at a steep internal cost, but with undeniable strategic effect. For the United States, this reality forced a reassessment. The question was no longer just how to deal with Venezuela's government, but how to manage competition with other great powers without turning Venezuela into a permanent outpost of rival influence. The longer the standoff continued, the harder that balance became. In the end, Venezuela's importance to Washington was no longer rooted solely in oil or ideology. It was rooted in the structure of the international system itself. In a world drifting toward multipolarity, Venezuela represented a warning: influence must be maintained, or it will be replaced, and for the United States, that was precisely why letting Venezuela go remained unthinkable. In public, U.S. policy toward Venezuela has often been framed in moral terms. Words like democracy, human rights, and rule of law dominate official statements. From congressional hearings to presidential speeches, Washington presents its stance as a principled defense of democratic values against authoritarianism. But behind this moral language lies a deeper, more complicated question: where do values end and power begin? Since the early 2000s, Venezuela has been a frequent subject of scrutiny by international organizations and human rights groups. Reports documenting electoral irregularities, restrictions on the press, political detentions, and excessive use of force by security services have circulated widely. Organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have repeatedly warned of democratic erosion. These reports provided Washington with a powerful moral framework to justify pressure. For U.S. officials, Venezuela became a clear narrative case, a once democratic country sliding into authoritarianism under leaders who manipulated institutions and silenced dissent. In this framing, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and international campaigns were not acts of coercion, but of responsibility. The United States, it argued, was standing with the Venezuelan people against an abusive state, yet critics questioned the consistency of this moral stance. They pointed out that U.S. relationships with other governments, some with comparable or worse human rights records, remained intact. Why, they asked, was Venezuela singled out? The answer, many argued, lay not in values alone, but in strategic relevance. Democracy, in this context, functioned as both principle and instrument. The Organization of American States became a key battleground for this moral diplomacy. The U.S. pushed hard for resolutions condemning Venezuela, suspensions from regional forums, and collective action. Supporters viewed this as multilateral defense of democratic norms. Opponents saw it as institutionalized pressure, driven largely by U.S. influence. Inside Venezuela, the moral framing was deeply contested. The government rejected accusations of dictatorship, insisting that elections, however flawed, continued to take place and that sovereignty was being undermined by foreign interference. State media portrayed U.S. concern for democracy as selective outrage, masking an agenda of control. For many Venezuelans, the debate over democracy felt distant from daily struggles for food, medicine, and stability. This gap between moral language and lived reality became increasingly visible as sanctions tightened. While Washington emphasized that sanctions were targeted, their broader economic effects were undeniable. Hospitals struggled, infrastructure decayed, and poverty deepened. Human rights organizations themselves began issuing complex assessments, condemning government repression while warning that sanctions exacerbated humanitarian suffering. This created an uncomfortable contradiction. Policies justified in the name of human rights were contributing to conditions that harmed basic human welfare. U.S. officials countered that responsibility lay with the Venezuelan government, which could end the crisis by changing course. But for critics, this argument sidestepped the ethical dilemma of means versus ends. Democracy promotion has long been a pillar of U.S. foreign policy, especially in the post-Cold War era. But Venezuela exposed its limits. Unlike fragile states dependent on Western aid, Venezuela possessed resources and alternative partners. Pressure did not produce swift reform, instead, it hardened positions. Moral condemnation did not isolate the government completely. It polarized the population further. At the same time, the moral narrative served an important domestic function in the United States. It helped build bipartisan consensus for a tough stance. Framing Venezuela as a democracy versus dictatorship issue simplified a complex geopolitical struggle into a familiar moral script. This made disengagement politically difficult. Letting Venezuela go would risk appearing indifferent to authoritarianism. Internationally, the message was equally significant. U.S. officials wanted to signal that democratic backsliding would carry consequences. Venezuela became a warning to other governments: elections alone were not enough, alignment with democratic norms, and with the U.S.-led order, mattered. Whether intentional or not, Morality and power became intertwined, yet over time, the clarity of this narrative eroded. As years passed without democratic transition, questions multiplied. If moral pressure failed to achieve moral outcomes, what justified its continuation? Was the goal restoration of democracy, or containment of a defiant regime? By the early 2020s, even some U.S. policymakers began to acknowledge the limits of moral absolutism. Quiet diplomacy resumed. Talks about easing sanctions in exchange for incremental reforms surfaced. The language softened, shifting from demands to negotiations. This did not represent abandonment of values, but recognition that values alone could not dictate outcomes. Venezuela thus exposed a central tension in U.S. foreign policy, the desire to act as a moral leader in a world that increasingly resists moral hierarchy. In a multipolar system, appeals to democracy compete with claims of sovereignty and non-interference. The authority of moral judgment is no longer uncontested. For Washington, the reluctance to let Venezuela go is therefore not just strategic, it is ideological. To disengage would mean admitting that moral language does not always compel compliance. It would mean accepting that the U.S. cannot always shape political outcomes, even when it believes it is on the right side of history. In the end, Venezuela stands as a mirror. It reflects both the aspirations and the contradictions of American power. Democracy and human rights remain powerful ideals, but when fused too tightly with geopolitical objectives, they risk becoming tools rather than ends. And once that happens, letting go becomes not just a strategic challenge, but a moral one. For years, U.S. policy toward Venezuela appeared frozen, locked in moral language, sanctions frameworks, and demands for political change. But global events have a way of forcing reassessment. In the early 2020s, a series of energy shocks disrupted assumptions that had underpinned American confidence. Suddenly, Venezuela was no longer just a diplomatic problem, it was a potential solution. The turning point came as global energy markets tightened. Supply disruptions, rising demand, and geopolitical crises elsewhere sent oil prices soaring. For the United States, which had grown accustomed to relative energy security, the shock was sobering. Domestic production could not fully insulate the country from global volatility. Energy, once again, became a strategic vulnerability. In this context, Venezuela's vast oil reserves re-entered Washington's calculations. For years, policymakers had treated Venezuelan oil as politically toxic, too compromised by sanctions, too entangled with adversaries. But high prices and constrained supply forced a more pragmatic question: could limited engagement with Venezuela serve U.S. interests without abandoning core principles? This recalibration was quiet, deliberate, and cautious. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic reversals. Instead, diplomatic channels reopened discreetly. U.S. officials met Venezuelan counterparts behind closed doors. The language shifted, from regime change to negotiations, from ultimatums to incentives. The goal was no longer transformation, but stabilization. A key symbol of this shift was the renewed role of Chevron. Once constrained by sanctions, the American oil company received limited authorization to resume certain operations in Venezuela. The move was carefully framed as technical and temporary. But its significance was unmistakable. Washington was signaling that absolute isolation was no longer sustainable. For the Venezuelan government, this moment validated long-held claims. It argued that sanctions were never purely about democracy, but about control over energy resources. Any sign of engagement, Caracas insisted, proved that oil, not values, ultimately drove U.S. decisions. Whether fair or not, this narrative resonated with many observers across the global South. From Washington's perspective, however, pragmatism did not equal surrender. Officials insisted that engagement was conditional. Sanctions relief would be tied to electoral reforms, humanitarian access, and political dialogue. The United States aimed to balance competing priorities, reduce global energy pressure while maintaining leverage over Venezuela's political future. This balancing act revealed a deeper truth. Venezuela had outlasted expectations. Despite sanctions, isolation, and internal crisis, the state remained intact. The opposition was fragmented. Allies had adapted. The costs of a frozen policy were becoming harder to ignore. At the same time, abandoning pressure entirely risked undermining years of moral positioning. Energy pragmatism also exposed contradictions in U.S. messaging. For years, Washington had framed Venezuela as an illegitimate regime unworthy of engagement. Now, necessity demanded conversation. This shift was not lost on allies or rivals. It reinforced perceptions that U.S. policy, while values-driven in rhetoric, remains interest-driven in practice. Domestically, the recalculation was sensitive. Rising fuel prices affect voters directly. Energy insecurity translates quickly into political pressure. Quiet diplomacy with Venezuela allowed U.S. leaders to address practical concerns without openly reversing course. In this sense, pragmatism became a form of damage control. Globally, the message was mixed. Some saw engagement as realism, or recognition that diplomacy must adapt to circumstances. Others viewed it as inconsistency, undermining U.S. credibility on democracy and human rights. For countries navigating their own relationships with Washington, Venezuela became a lesson in patience. Pressure may be intense, but time can shift priorities. The recalculation also underscored why the U.S. remains reluctant to let Venezuela go. Energy markets are global, interconnected, and unpredictable. Having influence, however limited, over a major oil holder provides strategic flexibility. Complete disengagement would mean surrendering options in moments of crisis, yet this pragmatism carries risks. Partial engagement can entrench existing power structures without producing reform. It can blur moral lines and weaken leverage. Venezuela's leadership has proven adept at extracting concessions while offering minimal change. Washington knows this, but also knows that rigid policies can backfire. In many ways, Part 6 marks a return to an old pattern. Throughout history, U.S.-Venezuela relations have oscillated between principle and pragmatism, pressure and partnership. Oil has always been the pivot. What changes is not the underlying logic, but the context in which it operates. As global competition intensifies and energy transitions accelerate, Venezuela's role remains uncertain. Its oil infrastructure is degraded. Its production capacity diminished. But its potential is undeniable. And potential is enough to keep Washington engaged. The quiet recalculation does not mean the conflict is resolved. It means it has entered a new phase, one defined less by slogans and more by trade-offs. The United States has not let Venezuela go. Instead, it has adjusted its grip, recognizing that influence in a turbulent world often requires flexibility rather than forced. In the final analysis, energy shocks did what years of pressure could not: they forced realism. And realism, in geopolitics, rarely allows for clean endings. After decades of confrontation, pressure, negotiation, and recalculation, one truth has become increasingly clear: the United States' relationship with Venezuela is not defined by a single policy failure or ideological clash. It is defined by something deeper, by the nature of power itself, and by how difficult it is for great powers to accept limits. At first glance, the question seems simple. Why doesn't the United States disengage from Venezuela and move on? The country is politically unstable, economically damaged, and diplomatically contentious. Yet the persistence of U.S. attention suggests that Venezuela represents more than a troubled state. It represents a challenge to long-standing assumptions about influence, control, and credibility. Throughout this documentary, a pattern has emerged. Oil created the initial bond. Ideology hardened it. Sanctions tested it. Rival powers complicated it. Energy shocks revived it. Each phase added layers to a relationship that was never allowed to fade. At every turning point, the United States faced an implicit choice: adapt, escalate, or disengage. Disengagement was consistently the least chosen option. This reluctance is not unique to Venezuela. Great powers rarely walk away from spaces they once dominated. Influence, once exercised, becomes psychologically difficult to relinquish. For Washington, Venezuela sits at the intersection of geography, resources, and symbolism. It is close enough to matter, rich enough to tempt, and defiant enough to provoke. Letting Venezuela go would mean accepting that a country in the U.S. strategic orbit can reject American leadership, endure sustained pressure, and survive by aligning elsewhere. that acceptance would echo far beyond Latin America. It would resonate in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, regions where governments carefully watch how the U.S. treats defiant states. There is also the question of precedent. U.S. foreign policy has long relied on the idea that sustained pressure produces compliance. Venezuela challenges that logic. Despite sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and internal crisis, the state endured. This does not mean the policy had no effect. It caused real damage, but it did not achieve its central political goal. Admitting this openly would force a broader reckoning with the limits of coercive power. Venezuela also exposes the tension between moral leadership and strategic interest. Democracy and human rights matter deeply to American identity and rhetoric. But when these values collide with energy security, geopolitical competition, and domestic political costs, trade-offs emerge. The quiet recalibration of recent years reflects this reality. Principles remain, but they operate within constraints. From Caracas, the story looks different. Venezuelan leaders frame endurance as victory. Survival itself becomes proof that U.S. dominance is not absolute. This narrative resonates in a world increasingly skeptical of Western authority. Whether or not Venezuela's model is attractive, its defiance is instructive. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people remain caught in between. For them, geopolitical symbolism offers little comfort. Their daily reality has been shaped by economic collapse, political repression, and social fragmentation. Any honest conclusion must acknowledge this human cost. The struggle over Venezuela has never been abstract, it has been lived. So what does letting go actually mean? It does not necessarily mean approval. It does not mean silence. And it does not mean abandoning concern for democracy or human rights. Letting go, in this context, would mean redefining influence, not as control, but as engagement without illusion. It would mean accepting that the United States cannot always shape outcomes, only respond to them. This is a difficult adjustment for a power accustomed to setting the terms. But it may be an inevitable one. The global system is shifting. Power is more distributed. Alignment is more fluid. Venezuela is not the cause of this transformation, it is a symptom of it. For the United States, the future relationship with Venezuela will likely remain uneasy and transactional. Periods of pressure will alternate with periods of pragmatism. Rhetoric will rise and fall. What is unlikely is a clean resolution. The conflict has outgrown any single leader or policy. In the end, the U.S. reluctance to let Venezuela go is about more than Venezuela. It is about how power adapts when it can no longer assume obedience. It is about whether influence can evolve from dominance to coexistence. And it is about whether letting go can sometimes be a strategic choice rather than a defeat. History suggests that great powers struggle most not when they are challenged, but when they are forced to change how they see themselves. Venezuela has become such a mirror for the United States, reflecting both its reach and its limits. As the world moves forward, the question may no longer be whether the U.S. will let Venezuela go, but whether it can learn to live with a Venezuela that was never truly under its control to begin with, and in that answer lies the future of American power in a changing world.